Michael Mackenzie, Kelly Doyle, Travis Smith, Randall Lotowikes, Brunson Hoole, Abby Mueller, Betsy Glick, and my wonderful agent, Samantha Shea. It just many hands touched this beautiful book that Michael instructed me to hold up. This beautiful book from the design, proofreading, editing, publicity, all of it. So I just feel so grateful to be here with this book today. Okay, so I will read, thank you for indulging me. I will read you a small section from the story Earthly Pleasures. Let me just find it. Okay, I'm just going to read you a little bit from Earthly Pleasures. I'm jumping a little bit in the middle. This is an alcoholic painter. It's an alcoholic painter. I think that's all you need to know right now. But I was young. Sometimes I believed I was beautiful. I spent all my money on paint and canvas. I lived in the same tiny place I painted and breathed in the ferocious smell, even as I slept. Though I never smoked, I loved to drink. I would stand in front of the mirror with a tumbler of pure gin in my hand and my lips parted, practicing a cocktail laugh. I would practice standing on the balls of my feet in high heels, walking from one end of the room to the other. Who or what was I practicing for? Dimly, I imagined some moment, some party, where my head would turn at the right angle and I would laugh just right. Really, it had no purpose. I drank until my eyes got blurry and felt heavy, and I would lie right down on the middle of my floor. This was the kind of drinking I did alone. In public, I kept a white wine or beer and only drank enough to feel it start. I may come home afterward and drink a little more, or put a song I liked and dance to it, or eat a piece of toast. It was a pleasure to get home after a party and turn on all the lights and take off my shoes and dance, or to spill honey on a piece of bread spread thick with butter to hold food in my mouth, or taste the first spiky sip of real alcohol, gin or vodka. They were the secret pleasures of the body that animals must feel too. Sleep was a pleasure, falling asleep in bed or on the floor. I was alone, sometimes lonely. I had headaches. Yes, I felt sometimes desperate. But I couldn't deny my life held all the earthly pleasures any person could hope to expect.
Thank you for reading that section. I love this story. I feel sometimes that this story is the centerpiece of your collection. And you didn't read a part that reveals this, but this story is about this alcoholic painter meets Krishna, who is a celebrity slash God. Could you tell us a little bit about how this story came to be?
Yeah, I actually saw this incredible picture or series of photographs by this Indian photographer that depicted Krishna in very modern settings. Like in one of them, he's standing in like an SUV in like hyper saturated colors. And I just sometimes it's so funny because sometimes I feel like I'll just be like, oh, I'll just write this for fun. Like, this is a crazy idea. I mean, I was like rereading the story a little while ago and I was like, this is like some pretty elaborate Krishna fan fiction, really. So I was just like, this was a story that was like for fun. And I just had this little seed was planted in my mind. Like, what if Krishna was a celebrity? What if Krishna existed in this world? What would that look like? And really, I just followed the story to the end. Over the course of many years, I had this little seed germinating. And after a while, this voice started to describe this party where she met Krishna. And then after that, I just followed the story all the way to the end. And I also think like Krishna, I grew up listening to stories about Krishna. He was my favorite. And he's such a friendly, he's a lover, but he's also everybody's friend. He's like Arjun's friend. He's so playful and friendly. I just wanted to imagine what would it be like to be friends, to be able to talk to Krishna, who's like, in some ways like my own childhood companion because I'd grown up listening to stories about him and imagining him.
I love that. I love the section that you just read, and especially that line, they were the secret pleasures of the body that animals must feel too. When I think of your writing, that's exactly what I think of. What I love about your prose is that pleasure is the line that pulls me through a story, rather than, you know, sort of like the traditional mechanisms that we think about when we think about the craft of fiction, like tension, conflict, plot, character development. Of course, your story has all of those, and you do those things very well. But really, when I'm reading as a reader, I'm following a line of pleasure, seeking to deepen and develop it. And yeah, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about your relationship with pleasure, as a reader and as a writer, and specifically as the writer of these stories.
Thank you, Meng. That's such a nice question. Pleasure is of primary importance to me. It is the most important thing in my writing, I think. There's other things I want to talk about and think about in my stories, but pleasure is primary, both the literal actual pleasure of the sound of the language or the images, but and the pleasure of just being in somebody's consciousness and experiencing the sensory world that they're living in. I don't know, you know, I was thinking about it recently. I think that my answers slightly changed since the pandemic, where I feel like I take pleasure even more seriously now than I think I did before, where I think that pleasure can be, it's not just a frivolous thing that's like, oh, it's so nice that we feel pleasure, whether it's like enjoying the smell of the air where you are, or, you know, the sun on your arm, or the pleasure of being close to somebody, or the pleasure of just like reading something that makes you laugh or feel good. Like those things, I think we think of those things as like extra, but actually pleasure seems to me in reading and in life like a primary importance, that is like what allows us to feel human. And I've noticed that about myself, that the times that I'm the most shut down emotionally and having the most difficult times are the times I have difficulty experiencing pleasure. And that's like kind of a no-brainer, except that I think that there's some meaning that I derive from pleasure that gives me like purpose and meaning. And that is that's the thing I'm the most interested in when I'm writing.
Yeah, you can definitely feel that in the work, which makes it very pleasurable to read as well. I feel like in your writing sensibility, pleasure is rooted in the body, right, and in sensory consciousness, and it has this way of making the writing feel erotic, even when there isn't sex involved. Although there is plenty of sex in this book. For instance, I feel like I can think of so many scenes of eating, or of like being pregnant, that feel so deliciously sensual. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think about the body and sensory consciousness, how it informs your work, whether it's an aesthetic for you or a subject matter or something else.
Yeah, you know, I think that it is not conscious that the body is brought up so much, or even that my beautiful title of this beautiful book, the title was not my title. Actually, it was the editor of the Paris Review who published that story. The title story had picked that out of the book, of the story, to make it into the much better title. My title was Tinder, which is like has too many other connotations. So that's like, it's kind of some of these things, I guess what I'm trying to say is some of these things I notice, like, it's not that they're an accident. It's just that I'm not totally conscious of just how important the body is and how central the body is in my writing. Yeah, I don't really remember the rest of the question anymore, Meng. I'm so sorry.
So I also noticed that there are a lot of references to or retellings of Hindu myths, right? Very obviously in Earthly Pleasures, but also like scattered throughout the other stories. In the title story, there is a section where, I'm quoting Shruti Swamy here, the mother poured a spoon of blue medicine down the girl's throat, bitter, but she told the girl of Shiva's heroism, sucking the poison from the ocean as it was churned by the gods for nectar and holding it in his dark throat so the rest would not be harmed. And the way you describe or retell these myths feel also deeply embodied. And I wonder if that's a character of the myths themselves, or something that you bring to them. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to you know, writing myth into mostly realist stories.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't actually, this is another thing that I didn't actually notice that I had done quite as much as I had done it. The the reaching to myth, because there's a couple stories that, like, you know, Earthly Pleasures has Krishna in it, and there's another story that takes a little part of the Ramayana and reworks it. But you're totally right that there's so many myths that are just, when I noticed it, it was because I just realized how deeply these myths were my reference point, that when I reached for a metaphor so often, or just reached for a different situation to bring into the story, that was just what my hand caught all the time. And it's because, and it's really a beautiful thing for me. I grew up in America, and I have a really complicated relationship because I grew up in America. I don't speak any Indian languages very well. I don't actually, no, I really technically do not speak any Indian languages at all. I can like kind of understand Hindi. So there's a lot of ways that as I reflect back on, especially when I was a child, when I was in elementary school and younger, I've been remembering recently all the times that I made choices to be American. And I didn't understand that I was doing it at the time. I didn't understand that that choice was even being asked of me and I was choosing anything. But there are times where I really turned away. I grew up in a really white environment, and there are times I really turned away from my Indianness in a way that I'm really trying to not undo, but kind of grow around now and reach back into that culture, because there was some just necessary, or it felt necessary, severances just growing up as an immigrant's child. So it's really kind of nice to me to know that still, these stories, my parents told me these stories all the time. I also had these like little Amar Chitra Katha comic books, and these were very vivid stories for me, that they came into me very deeply, and they really inform who I am in a profound way. They inform the way that I think about things and the way that I see myself. So the fact that these myths show up in my work, it reminds me that I'm tied to India and to the heritage of my parents in ways that I didn't totally expect. And it's it's really wonderful to see it.
Yeah, they really, there's nothing self-conscious about them in the way that they appear in the stories either. They really appear in the stories the same way I feel like that you describe them appearing in your life. So good job, Shruti.
Thank you, Meng.
I want to talk about sex, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's totally fine. Family, you can just mute this part if you're getting squicked out. Thanks for coming.
There are a number of sex scenes in this book. And what struck me about them was that they, you know, there are a lot of sex scenes in literature, period. But none of these sex scenes read like anything I'd quite read before. They felt so distinctly rooted perhaps in female pleasure. And in particular, they just felt so different from a lot of the sex writing that has shaped American letters. Like I'm thinking of like Philip Roth or James Salter, maybe Salinger, where sexual conquest is just this sort of foil for the protagonist's failures and desires and growth and XYZ. But sex in your stories, it rarely has to do with plot or conflict, but it feels like more of a way for the characters to connect deeply to their bodies and return to themselves, which makes, which when, you know, it's not always pleasurable in these stories. So when there is trauma involved, it makes it all the more painful because they can't connect with themselves in that way. And I guess I wonder if this is something that you thought about consciously when you were writing the scenes, sort of like writing against a tradition of writing about sex.
Yeah, let me just think about that for a sec, because I really like that question. I mean, I've been thinking about this, we've been talking about this, this idea that, what does it mean to be a woman of color writer? Like, what does a story look like if you're not either responding to or rejecting the models that you've seen that have been like, whatever, formed by like a white male aesthetic. And in our conversation, a few weeks ago, you just said, like, I don't know if I think that you have been writing as a woman of color. Cause I was like, I have to reject this. Like, I think that I've been writing, you know, like I have this like idea of what a short story is and I don't even know what it is anymore. And I have to like maybe reject all of these things and like totally start all over. And you were like, well, don't you think that maybe you are actually just writing like a woman of color? Do you really feel like your stories are adopting a male voice or trying to fit into a certain aesthetic? And that was really helpful to me because I realized that actually the form of the story is a lot more malleable and forgiving than I was thinking of it before. And in the context of your question about sex, like I learned how to write from James Salter and Andre Dubus and Raymond Carver. I loved them very much when I read them when I was learning how to write. And Salter in particular, because Salter is such a like sensual writer and he does write about sex like a lot, like a lot. So I'm sure that there's some element, maybe even just the permission to write about sex. What I learned something from them, that was a worthwhile thing to write about and an interesting thing. To me, sex in all of these stories is a form of communication. And sometimes that's a communication that's just a wordless communication of intimacy between two people negotiating space in different ways. And then sometimes that's an ugly negotiation of power. But it's always a form, almost like dialogue, you know, it's like a form of communication and that can change and move things between these characters and within these characters themselves. So I think that I haven't really thought about the sex scenes that I learned from, I guess, consciously in a long time. But I'm sure that I'm sure when I think about it now, I do feel like at least the permission and the idea that was important and watching how those sex scenes functioned, even if I did something different than what they did, that there probably was some, I mean, there's a lot of influence. There's a lot of influence from these complicated, literary short story forefathers.
Yeah, that makes me think of a James Baldwin essay. I don't remember which one because I'm very bad at titles, but he asks something like, you know, does Shakespeare belong to me too? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So most of your stories have earthly pleasures included, and I think most of the stories in this collection, and when I think about your prose, it has this like sort of languorous, luxurious pace. I feel like I'm like floating down the Nile on a day. Not that I've ever floated down the Nile. That's how they make me feel. But there are two stories that have a very distinctively different feeling in this collection, and they are The Laughter Artist and A House is a Body, the title story. So I wonder could you read from one of these stories to give everyone a sense of what that sounds like?
Yes, gladly. I think I'll read from A House is a Body. I had it. I'm just going to read the first part so you don't really need to know anything else about it. Not the scent of the smoke, but the sight of it. Not the sight itself, but the screen through which it altered the sunlight. She couldn't articulate the change exactly. It's just that the light seemed odd, like the sour light of a nightmare. She had overslept. She was used to waking at the sound of his alarm, risen dazed and blinking into this odd day, the cool and yellow morning. Before she woke the girl, she stood on the deck. I have use of my limbs, she thought, without knowing why she thought it, and went back into the house. She dressed the child and combed her hair and shook cereal into a bowl for her. The child seemed not to notice anything at all, still pliant with sleep, and ate without speaking, but with an unfocused concentration she brought to most tasks, that she brought even to her dreams, her face concentrated even in the task of its dreaming, mirroring perhaps a dream face that rarely smiled. It was too late now to hurry, and the girl ate slowly. The mother had the urge to smack her. She turned her eyes down to her mug of coffee and took a sip from it. Without milk or sugar, it tasted only of acid. Drank. She was coming awake. Where's Daddy today? Halfway through the soggy bowl. The daughter was halfway through the soggy bowl. Went to work early. You know, he might get home late too tonight, after you're in bed. I feel funny, said the girl. Funny how? Shrugged. The mother put a testing hand against a silky forehead. You're fine. I feel funny. No, she wasn't fine. The forehead was hot. But Jesus, God, just a moment alone, today of all days. Children made noise, the woman had been told, but nobody had ever told her that the noise children made would be intolerable. The noise they made, the sneezing and singing and screaming and shrieking. Nothing wrong when she raced to the other room. The child was shrieking with delight and crying, a scraped knee, a broken doll, and the crashing of toys and furniture and bodies. This noise was constant, slowly growing throughout the waking hours, swelling in the afternoon to an evening crescendo, the noise under everything, diminishing every pure thought and action, the noise she could not quite block out but had to monitor for signs of true distress. Even alone, one child, Christ, imagine two, looking down at the sick daughter. She was small. She was 6 years old, very small, but turning already, or she should say finally human with her own thoughts. Dark as her father, darker than him, the mother had not made a mark on her.
Thank you. What I love about that story is that it has this like barreling directness. The sentences just keep moving and plowing till the end. And I wonder, what was it about this story in particular? Did you feel like it needed that kind of tone? What brought this different style and voice to this story?
Well, it just started with that first sentence, and I heard that sentence like it was like like I heard that rhythm and the length of it. My sentences got really long for a period in my writing life, because I had just finished reading Proust, and he has such long sentences. It just kind of like infected me, sort of. But that rhythm of that sentence I heard, and that just dictated the rest of the story. The kind of this story had is like overwhelming. Even to me, the story is overwhelming. The language is like intense and overwhelming. And I wanted to talk about the experience of being inside anxiety. I mean, actually what the story is about is anxiety coming true, which is what is happening to us right now. It's like, what if anxiety is telling you something really terrible is happening and we're in huge danger and you have to do something. And then it's like true, it's right now. So I think I was really interested in just bringing the reader briefly, it's not a super long story, briefly into that feeling. And so the language seemed the clearest way to do that, rather than, I mean, a lot of bad stuff is happening. There's a forest fire, and her daughter is sick. But so there's lots of things are kind of closing in plot wise. But that was all dictated by the language. By that first line, I think I knew that I needed that kind of like almost like smothering of language. There's so much language coming at you in that story.
Yeah, I love that. Definitely is how that story feels. Yeah, so it's also one of the stories that is very clearly about a mother and a daughter, right? But motherhood, pregnancy, parenthood, there are a lot of parent and child relationships throughout this collection. And you mentioned in the beginning that you became a parent recently, but you wrote many of these stories before you did become a parent. So I wonder if, why do you think you were drawn to these themes even before then? Are you still writing about them now? If so, how differently or the same?
This story, hilariously, as I was just reading it about the noise of children having been trapped in my house with my 2-year-old, was written before I became a mother, but was very accurate in terms of just how much noise only one child can make. Actually, all of these stories were written before I became a mother, though some of them were edited, and all of them were edited, but some of them particularly were tuned up in order to match. Mostly it was like technical stuff. Like there's a baby in the mourners, and when I was rereading, I was like, how old is this baby? Is this baby 3 months or is this baby 7 months? Like, are they setting up? So it's like stuff like that. And there's a story called My Brother at the Station where the narrator is pregnant. And then I wrote it before I was pregnant, but coming back and being able to just like really be able to embody the physicality of that more from my experience was something that I could bring to that. Why do I write about motherhood so much? I'm not sure. I was thinking about it this morning because I think there must be a reason for it. It possibly is just because I've just always been interested in being a mother. I've always known I wanted to be a mother, and I find it confusing when people, like the way that our culture treats motherhood, like as though it's like boring. Like it definitely, just like any other kind of labor, is like a lot of work, and not everything about it is interesting. But it's like a time when you first of all get to spend so much time so close to a child consciousness, which is just an absolute marvel. Even when she's driving me crazy, still her consciousness is a marvel. And even before I had children, like I remembered my consciousness as a child somewhat, and remembered how incredibly vivid the world was. So just having children in my stories and letting them be in relation, they have that kind of brutal, honest logic that sometimes that adults don't have. They're almost like animals sometimes in the way they communicate so much. They feel things so deeply in their bodies. They don't have language the way that we do. And they just think so differently. So I think I was interested in children. I think that there's just something so amazing, and it sounds like it's because it's a language problem, that there's nobody and then there's somebody. Like when you are pregnant and then you have this child, it's like I was just in my body by myself, and I know for a fact that nobody else was in there. And then suddenly this whole person with this whole soul and consciousness like came out, like, and now here they are. So I think that there's something like pretty amazing to me about that still. And it was always amazing to me, just in the same way that death is so amazing to me, where it's like there was just a person there, and now where did they go? I mean, these are children's questions, because we don't have language for this kind of, like, it sounds banal almost, or like a cliche when you try and put these like fundamental mysteries into words. But I think the other thing that's interesting is because you have that knowledge. We have that knowledge all the time when we walk around, and then we're still doing things. We're like still like paying our taxes or whatever. But then sometimes it's like having a child is just like having this constant, it's like you're doing the most mundane stuff possible, like changing diapers, and then you're also like, there's this little person who has a soul. How did this happen? If you believe in souls, which I guess I do. So I think that that's a really interesting place for fiction to be. Both the like relation, the kind of, and the balance of power is really interesting, and can also be shifting in really interesting ways. And also just like, you know, this like the absolute like most profound mystery of our lives next to the most mundane thing possible, which is like what life is, but just heightening that in fiction can be a really interesting tension.
So I want to alert the people who are watching that I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A. So you should start thinking about your questions, and there's a little Q&A thing at the bottom where you can type them in. I'm gonna ask Shruti maybe one, maybe two more questions, and then I'll start pulling from the Q&A. So start thinking about your questions. I love hearing you talking about being a mother and motherhood and children. I feel like most of what we're getting in the culture is like, oh my God, it sucks so much. And I like that. And that's very true. You acknowledge that, but I love how, yeah, you're the, you know, first person I listen to talking about motherhood who's like, it sucks so much, but also maybe it's worth it. It's a beautiful experience. There are a number of stories in this collection where becoming a parent or being pregnant works as a sort of hinge. There's like one paragraph, and there's like a wonderful symmetry between the like before and the after, to put it kind of in a very simple way. It's much more complex in Shruti stories. For instance, blindness. The first story, or My Brother at the Station, as you mentioned. I think Dee Dee is another one that does that. So I wonder, like, do you think about shape and symmetry in crafting short stories?
No, I mean, definitely not when I'm writing. I think that's so, I mean, I do think that many of these stories were written over the course. I mean, actually, absolutely, yes, just not when I'm writing them. I think that there's a time when I'm just following the line of the story to see where it goes. And then there's like the editing where I'm like, oh, this is happening here and this is happening here. And then I'm pulling it out. But so much of the work already happens just in this mysterious subterranean level that expresses itself and surprises even me. And I often don't really know where my stories are going. I actually almost never have an endpoint. It opens with a situation or a feeling or an image. And then from there, and then I just follow it. So yes, so shape is important to me, and I'm also interested in other kinds of shapes. Like, I think that, you know, the shape of just the classic, I don't know if any of these stories don't follow that shape, I should say, but I am interested in the possibilities of what the story can do if they are shaped, if their shapes are different than that. And I think there's almost like more room in a novel to make weird shapes than it is in stories, or it feels that way, but I'm interested in both mediums.
So this is a question from Mimi Locke. During the process of putting this book together, what did you discover about the stories as you revisited them, or about yourself as a writer?
That's a great question, Mimi. I'm only laughing because I was wondering if it was the other question from Mimi, which was just a compliment about how great we looked, which I appreciate very much, Mimi. Thank you. Sorry, can you repeat the question, Mug? Or maybe I can just look at it. Process of book together, what did you discover about the stories as you revisited them, or about yourself as a writer? I was really surprised by how many echoes between the stories there were. It was something that I was like, I put this story collection together like over the course of many, many years, and it changed many times. The shape of the collection, the what stories were even in the collection, changed a lot. And so and I was always like, what makes this a story collection? What feels cohesive about it? Because my stories don't share they don't share any characters. They don't really share any settings. They're not like, I think there are thematic things that that are resonant throughout the collection, but nothing that I could really be like, this collection is about like motherhood or whatever, that would like sum up the whole collection. so I was really like a little bit like, what makes a collection? And it was really nice to see. Sometimes, I mean, I think as maybe any writer to their horror discovers, there's like certain images or like certain words that you use a lot actually, that you sort of have to, your editor has to gently point out, there's a lot of people looking at mirrors in this, in this collection. Maybe you want to pull out just a couple of those instances. But I think there's actually like kind of a fine line, right? Where you are always circling the same things and you're using your voice, and then sometimes it can just be just too repetitive, so you have to kind of shape that. So I think one of the things I noticed was how cohesively or how thematically similar many of these stories are, how much they echoed each other in terms of theme and image, and that which was surprising to me. I wasn't sure that I didn't know that was going to happen. And I feel like there's another part of that question. What did I discover about these stories? Okay, I think I hope that's sufficient, Mimi. Thank you for that nice question.
Yeah, those recurring themes are just your sensibility as a writer, right? Nothing to be ashamed about. From Aku, Shruti, I loved hearing you say we believe in souls. Can you talk more about the different ways that spirituality and your excitement about the human soul enters your writing?
Oh, great question, Aku. Yeah, and I just have to say, during this pandemic, as maybe is happening to a lot of people, like I just feel like I'm like really leaning hard into like, like crystals and like herbs, like all of that stuff, where I feel like I maybe had a little bit more skepticism about. Now, I mean, I don't think that's actually technically spirituality necessarily. I do think I've actually gotten more spiritual during the pandemic in terms of like, I've been creating rituals for myself. I've been trying to connect. I feel a deeper connection to the natural world. I feel a presence in trees now, which I didn't use. It's like a subtle presence, but I feel their presence now. That's not an answer to your question at all. Let me look at your question again. It's so nice that you can just look at it. That spirituality and the human soul enters my writing. Yeah, this is like, it's actually, even though I don't know how spiritual of a person I was before the pandemic, my writing practice is very close to me to a spiritual practice. It starts from a place of great mystery, and I just truly don't know where these stories. Sometimes I hear the voice that the story is in dictating the sentences to me very clearly. Like I know the rhythm of the sentence, and the diction of that voice is different than my diction. It's not how I speak, and it's not even the voice I think in. So it feels to me coming from a place of deep mystery. We were talking about this, Meng, I think, where it was like, were we talking about this? Where it was like, I just feel like I don't choose these stories and I have to keep writing them. I can't tell them, I can't force them in any direction. I have to listen to them. I have to write them. And if I refuse to write something because I'm scared of it, then I'll lose it. Like I have to write. And my practice is staying present and staying open. And which feels a lot like praying. It's like stepping into the darkness and having faith that your foot will fall on solid ground. So that's definitely always been part of my writing process. Yeah, thanks for that great question, Aku.
From Caitlin. These are all really great questions, by the way. Thanks, all of you. In Earthly Pleasures, the narrator is trying, not always successfully, to escape a sense of self-doubt that will derail her creative project. Seeing as you have successfully completed 2 books, what advice do you have for other creatives trying to overcome self-doubt?
Oh, Caitlin. What's that?
Oh, I said be friends with Krishna.
Yeah, Krishna he's a boon to the creative process. I think no, I am just as lost as anybody else. I just, I over the last few years, I've started to broaden the scope, and actually in lots of areas of my life, but definitely in writing, just broadening the scope of the time frame I'm looking at. So if I'm like, oh, I'm really not writing, you know, this week, this month. It's like, yeah, you're going to be like, God willing, writing when you're 80. So it's just like, if you're looking from now to 80 as opposed to now to next year, I think that there's just a lot more room and gentleness in that process. And I think that also like that we just are in such a like always like producing mode that I think of this like image. I read Braiding Sweetgrass at the beginning of the pandemic, which was such a beautiful, highly recommend that book. And she just talked about mushrooms and the like mushroom network that's like, you just can't see. It's like by the time the mushroom comes up, it's like you just barely see any of their actual mushroom, and they're like all connected under the ground. And I really think that that's a pretty good metaphor for the writing process. And that like, you know, you just look at the mushroom and you're like, I did it. I made this one mushroom. And if you don't have the mushroom, then you don't think that you're writing anything. But there's this vast network. There's all this work that's happening in communication and movement that's happening under the soil. And we can't just count the above ground mushroom as work. Like all of it is work. The movement, the thinking, the like being conscious and like living in the world, that is also a creative act. That's a creative process. And naming it as such can be really freeing, because you just like, you can take some of that pressure off of being like, I always have to be making more and more mushrooms. All right, I will stop with the mushroom metaphor now.
I love that. So Sunisa asks, are you working on stories much now? And how do you feel about the novel form and the short story form?
Thank you for asking, Sunisa. I am sort of working on stories. I'm trying to understand what stories, how does somebody get better at stories? I feel like I have some understandings of how to write a story now, but how do I just wonder. Anyways, that's something I've been like, how do I push myself to make like, how do I make this not harder for myself, but how do I get deeper? I want to get deeper. How do I get deeper? And so I'm still figuring that out. I've been working on a novel for many years. And so I think I'm also a little bit like bewildered by short stories in a useful way. I think it can be really helpful to not feel like you're an expert at something. Not that I ever really felt like I was an expert at writing a story, but I think you just develop like a certain amount of muscle memory, and then you're like, oh, okay, I could just do this and this and this. And then you're like, I think I maybe, wait, already did that before. And then you're not going any deeper. So though you were asking a question about what, okay, oh, sorry, Sunisa, I'm just gonna look at the question again. How do I feel about the novel form and the story form? I love the novel form. I always had this, like, I think in retrospect, very snobby thought where I was like, you can only do one well. They're like different genres. And if somebody's a good story writer, they'll never be a good novelist, which I really disagree with myself. I do agree that they are very different, and that you can be a really good novelist and not a very good short. Like, just because you were a good novelist, it doesn't necessarily, they don't translate. Those aren't translatable skills, but they're not like totally separate either. And you can totally figure out the other one. They still have some of the same principles. So, how I feel about them is just like a joy at the expansiveness that is present in both forms, and a curiosity about what's so pleasurable about writing a novel is that you're just like, I always know what I'm working on. I can just keep working on this novel. So it's really exciting, as I'm sure you know, Sunisa. It's so exciting to find that feeling where you're like, oh, this is a big thing. I have to spend time in this. That can be that feeling of that first discovery. I'm really excited about, or I am hopeful that I'll have that feeling soon, because I really enjoyed working on a novel. I like them both.
Mackenzie asks, your work plays with genre in some stories and others are told in a more realist mode. Could you talk about genre, fantasy or magic realism, or others in your work? And who are some of your influences or favorite genre writers?
Well, thank you, Mackenzie. And I'm sure you already know the answer to this, but thank you for asking anyways, which is obviously Ursula Le Guin. Ursula K. Le Guin is somebody who has been able to, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler is somebody who I really admire. Who else have I been reading? There's this incredible Indian short story writer named Vandana Singh, who writes science fiction short stories, I already said. I think there's just an incredible, I'm more and more drawn to genre because I think there's so much happening right now in genre, especially with writers of color, where they're using genre to do some really deep work about imagining what's possible for us. And I think all fiction does this. Like in some ways, all fiction is genre fiction in that way, where it's like, we really, even in the universe that I've created, some of it is fairly similar to our universe, but there's hopeful ways to me in which people relate to each other or understand themselves or find beauty and meaning in their lives. And I think that books, I love to put too much on books and be like, oh, they'll like change the world, or I think that there is that's too much to put on books. It's maybe what I'm saying, but I do think that stories, especially those in genre, but I think all stories can give us ways of seeing and looking and possibilities for ourselves, our lives, and our futures. That is absolutely vital. And I feel so blessed to be a reader of books that are explicitly doing that, as well as implicitly doing that.
Chris says, maybe this is a dumb question, but it's not a dumb question, Chris. I think it's a great question. How do you feel about intentionally using a fictional story as a way to process something in your own life? Or have you ever stumbled upon a personal revelation through the experiences of one of your characters?
That's not a dumb question, Chris. That's a wonderful question. And I actually was just thinking about it today. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, these stories in this book, which I will hold up again, A House is a Body. The stories in this collection are very autobiographical in some sense. They're like very emotionally autobiographical. So the details and the plots are, spun from some mysterious combination of elements that have just come out of the subconscious. But the emotional landscape of this book is absolutely my emotional landscape. These are the kinds of feelings that I've been navigating and grappling with and traversing. So I think all of these stories, not necessarily in terms of like, I'm having a hard time with this person and I'm going to explore that in fiction, not that directly, but I think that the ways that a lot of these stories were written because I was wondering how somebody would live after it happened. Like, what if this situation happened? How would they cope with that? How would they deal with it? And I asked that in a hopeful way, not in a way that would be like, well, they'd be totally destroyed and they would just not be able to function and they would give up living, right? I asked that question because I wanted the answer to be, there's still beauty and there's still meaning in all kinds of human life and all kinds of human experience. And so I wanted, I think that I was like sometimes writing through some of my worst fears in a controlled way, because I didn't know what the answer was. And I didn't know if people were going to be like, okay, in some sense, but I knew that that their lives would have that meaning in them, that they would have that humanity. And that's been a really deep source of comfort for me in some ways. That's definitely been part of my process, grappling with many things, like A House is a Body, forest fires coming and this woman's daughter's really sick and she's being a really bad mom. And like, those are some intersections of some of my worst fears, and being able to like walk through those fears with this woman was really, that's a really powerful thing to be able to do. It's one of the like greatest, I don't really believe in writing as therapy, I think, but I do think that writing and being able to be in control of a story and walk through a story and walk fearlessly through an experience can be incredibly powerful for the writer. for me as a writer.
So we have a couple more questions, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to combine them. What was the best short story you've ever read, and how has it changed your way of approaching writing? And perhaps along with that, which parts of writing and reading are most pleasurable to you?
Well, it's the best short story I ever read. But you know, I think I love the idea that there would be one short story that would be like, and then I found this one short story and it shattered me. And then I reconstituted myself from my pieces, and then I became this whole different person. I think that I've been reading a lot of different, it's for me, it's not one story, but it's rather seeing the ways that in the hands of so many different writers, how different language and story can be. So I can tell you some of my recent favorite short story collections, but first I will answer the other part of the question, which was what? Can you repeat it again, Meng? Sorry.
What parts of reading and writing are most pleasurable to you?
Oh, you know, when you just have that feeling and you're like, I think there's a story here, and you're just like curious about it. And then you're just like, no pressure. This can just be a paragraph, but you can just do it and it's just for fun. That feels really fun. And then also, I think being deeply into a story and then just having the lens of the story in your eyes as you're walking through your world. So you're looking and experiencing the story through language, your life through language. That is immensely pleasurable to me as a writer, and as a reader, it's actually very similar. Just hearing, I think some writers can just tune you to their consciousness, their ways of looking and seeing. And then you get to be with that consciousness, and you can look at your life, and it's so beautiful through their eyes. So that's one of the greatest pleasures of reading. And I'll just say quickly, a few story collections that I've really recently loved. I'm very obsessed with this story collection called The Kitchen at the Corner of the House by Zatamilian writer, published by Archipelago Books. It truly was mind-blowing. Mimi Locke recently published a collection called Last of Her Name, which is excellent. Also, Asako Sarazawa published a short story collection called Inheritors. And Vandana Singh, who I mentioned, and Elizabeth Towns is another one of my favorite story writers. And all of them, I think, do such an incredible job of showing you what stories can actually do. And they're so different and beautiful.
And so does this book show you what stories can do. And I sound a little cheeky here, but I'm being totally sincere. I just don't know how to say things sincerely, which is why I'm a writer and not a public speaker. I could really read this book. It's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing your words and your thoughts and your writing with us tonight, Shruti. And thank you to everyone who's here.
Well, thank you so much, Meng. That was really wonderful. And also, I don't think I said this at the beginning. Thank you so much to Green Apple Books for hosting us. This was really a delight. Thank you, everybody.
Happy to host. Yes, thank you, everybody, for coming. Please don't forget to buy Houses of Body and Little Gods. Yeah, and I think that's going to be it for tonight. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. And thank you, Meng and Shruti as well.